Chapter 9. War in Our Imaginations and Our Memories. Forgive us, says the chorus at the start of Act 4 of Shakespeare's Henry V, where, oh, for pity, we shall much disgrace with 4 or 5 most vile and ragged foils, right ill-disposed in brawl, ridiculous the name of Agincourt, yet sit and see, minding true things by what their mockeries be. In the scenes to come, Shakespeare will bring to the audience both the tragedy and the glory of war. The night before the battle, a pensive King Henry wanders incognito among his troops. Williams, an ordinary soldier talking to his friends, says simply he does not expect that they will live out the coming day. Henry probes, "Are they not happy to be with the king when his cause is such a just one?" He asks. "Well," says Williams, "that may be. But those who die will go to their deaths cursing, crying out for help, or worrying about the wives and children they leave behind. I'm afeard," he says, "there are few die well that die in a battle." Henry replies with a long-reasoned, and not particularly comforting speech about responsibility in war, and how every soldier should prepare his conscience so that he is ready to die a good death and achieve salvation. The next morning, however, he makes a different sort of speech. The coming battle, he tells his men, is their chance for glory. The day, he reminds them, is the feast of the twin saints, Crispin and Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when the day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian and Crispin. Crispian shall nater go by from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. A company commander in the East Yorkshire Regiment read extracts from Henry's stirring speeches to his men over the landing craft's loudspeaker as they neared Sword Beach on D-Day in 1944, and as the 1st Special Service Brigade disembarked, their imposing commander, Lord Lovat, led them with his personal piper, Bill Millen, wading through the water onto the beach, playing Highland Laddie and Road to the Isles. The great commanders, Alexander, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, MacArthur Montgomery, had the ability of great actors to reach out and make their men feel that their commanders knew them, cared about them, and were speaking directly to them. They grasped what Shakespeare had, that war's a sort of theater, and that theatrical gestures play their part. The giant cannon which the Ottomans made in the 15th century to guard the Dardanelles, the elephants brought to Italy by Hannibal or used by the Mughals in India, the nuclear bombs developed by the two sides in the Cold War, all were designed to terrify and intimidate the enemy as much as for actual war. Fighting, shock, and awe was what the coalition called the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We use our arts in war, but how we think about and wage it is in turn affected by our artistic representations of it. Plays, poems, novels, paintings, sculptures, photographs, music, and films shape how we, warriors and civilians alike, imagine and think about war. The arts can give us war's many aspects, from the heroic and glorious to the cruelty and horror. They can convey something of war's excitement and passions, as well as its craziness, its tedium and pointlessness. They remind us of the power and the complexity of war and of our own ambiguous feelings about it. The arts can urge us toward war as they did before the First World War, or help turn us against it as they did afterward. They help us process, remember, and commemorate war. The currents between the arts and war run both ways. War changes those who are creating its images and stories. Writers struggle to find new language, and painters experiment with styles. Goya abandoned color for the disasters of war and the long tradition of celebrating the victorious or heroic side of war to show its baseness. The moments of gratuitous cruelty, the shattered, mutilated bodies. The First World War, a cultural review said in 1916, was impossible to capture in pictures. No artist can give us a total impression of the things that go on in night and fog, under the earth and above the clouds. The death-defying men who march past and pounce on the enemy in battlefield canvases of the old school have disappeared. Communication trenches have swallowed them up. The Swiss painter Felix Vallotton, who fought in the French army. From now on, I no longer believe in blood-soaked sketches, in realistic painting, in things seen or even experienced. It is meditation alone which can draw out the essential synthesis of such evocations. His Verdun, that ghastly battle of attrition between the French and the Germans, is a pattern of flames, black and white, clouds of gas and smoke, beams of light, shattered landscapes, and falling rain, with no human beings to be seen. Perhaps it was merely a coincidence that in different cities across Europe and in the New World, artists were experimenting before 1914 with forms that suited the battlefields to come. The Cubists were developing a new idiom to capture the fragmentation of the world around them, while the Futurists tried to find ways to paint movement itself. In England, the Vorticists wanted to smash the existing order to pieces, and that, for them, meant a new geometric style that reflected the jagged nature of the modern world. Paul Nash, the British artist who was much influenced by the Vorticists, was soon to find himself sketching and painting smashed battlefields. Did they all somehow sense the catastrophe that was about to strike European society? Their experimentation was, sadly, all too well suited to the shattered landscapes of the battlefields and the play across them of light, rocket bursts, and waves of gas. Yet when we try to imagine war or rely on the imagination of others, we run up against the perennial question: can the reality of war ever be pinned down? Its experience confined within the pages of a book or a picture frame or a strip of film? In The Sorrow of War by Bao Ning, who fought for the North Vietnamese forces in the Vietnam War, his protagonist, himself a veteran, tries obsessively and doggedly to write his story of love and war. These flimsy pages represented Kien's past. The lines told stories that were sometimes clear, but most were at best obscure and as vague and pale as twilight. They told stories from the precariously fine border dividing life from death, blurring the line itself and finally erasing it. Ages and times were mixed in confusion, as were peace and war. When the book first came out, it was condemned by the communist authorities, and Ning has published very little since. The American writer Tim O'Brien, who fought on the other side, says, in The Things They to Generalize About War is like generalizing about peace. Almost everything is true, almost nothing is true. And can we, he asks, ever get at the meaning of war? In a true war story, if there's a moral at all, it's like the thread that makes the cloth. You can't tease it out. You can't extract the meaning without unraveling the deeper meaning. And in the end, really, there's nothing much to say about a true war story, except maybe Yet he has kept trying, as so many others have done before him and will do in the future. Wilfred Owen wrote to his mother of the very strange look he had seen on the faces of soldiers in 1917 at the huge British base of Etaples, an incomprehensible look which a man will never see in England. It was not despair or terror. It was more terrible than terror, for it was a blindfold look without expression, like a dead rabbit's. It will never be painted, and no actor will ever seize it. And to describe it, I think I must go back and be with them. In the Korean War, the American photographer David Douglas Duncan talked about trying to capture that soldier's look, which he called the 1,000-yard stare. Although much of the art produced by and about war focuses only on one side, the artist's own, a war will often provoke responses which transcend borders. All Quiet on the Western Front by the German writer Erich Maria Remarque says the same things about the futility of trench war, the comradeship among the soldiers, and the gulf between them and the home front, as do anti-war English-language novels such as Frederick Manning's The Middle Parts of Fortune and Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That. O'Brien and Ning were on different sides in Vietnam, but the jungle, the heat, the fear and the hauntings are there in the work of both. What Ning said of his main character, whose life so resembles his own, could as easily have been said of O'Brien's narrator, and into the stories also went the atmosphere of the dark jungle, with its noxious scents and legends and myths about the lives of ordinary soldiers whose very deaths provided the rhythm for his writing. Certain wars stimulate more and better art than others. The First World War brought great novels and poems in several languages, as well as great paintings and music. It is hard to think of a comparable outpouring from the Second World War. Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate is the great novel, but where are the others? And why did Vietnam, but not the two world wars or Korea, have such a galvanizing impact on the arts in the United States? In popular music, it was a golden age, with Creedence Clearwater Revival, Bruce Springsteen, Country Joe and the Fish, Bob Dylan and the Doors writing and recording songs about the war. In addition to O'Brien and his body of work, there are Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War, Michael Hare's Dispatches, and Carl Merlantis's Matterhorn, or the extraordinary range of films such as Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, and Apocalypse Now. It is surely no coincidence that these, like the great works of art from the First World War, are almost all critical of the war. For the Americans, Vietnam did what the First World War did for the Europeans. It shook their confidence in themselves and their civilization. Perhaps the need to get at the terrifying mystery of how we, who are good and moral people, could get involved in such a war and do such dreadful things, explains the impact of both wars on artists. Yet it is too easy to say that great art grows only out of the horror and futility of war. Against Benjamin, Britten's War Requiem, Tolstoy's War and Peace, or Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, we can counterpoise the winged victory of Samothrace, the Iliad, or Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel. John Ruskin, Victorian England's most influential art critic and a leading intellectual, may have surprised young officer cadets at Woolwich in a lecture on war in 1865 when he told them, "No great art ever yet arose on earth, but among a nation of soldiers." Peace, he argued, brought prosperity and contentment, but it also brought the withering away of the arts, because men were not being raised to their highest state, which only war could do. For it is an assured truth that whenever the faculties of men are at their fullness, they must express themselves by art. And so, he concluded, when I tell you that war's the foundation of all the arts, I mean also that it is the foundation of all the high virtues and faculties of men. As some of those who fight realize, there can be beauty in war itself. The Canadian painter A.Y. Jackson wrote near the end of the First World War, "I went with Augustus John one night to see a gases attack we made on the German lines. It was like a wonderful display of fireworks with our clouds of gas and the German flares and rockets of all colors." Shortly afterward, he painted his gas attack Leven, one of the most famous Canadian paintings of the period. And it too is a thing of beauty, with its somber dark foreground of blasted land, the hovering bluish-gray clouds, and the green and pink streaks of light. So is the opening shot of Apocalypse Now, with the graceful palms of the pristine green jungle gently swaying, and the tuk-tuk-tuk of helicopters drifting by. A few wisps of smoke curl up, then more, and then suddenly the whole scene goes up in flames. And such was the madness of the making of the film that an actual jungle was burned. All the while, the doors are singing the end. It is breathtaking, perhaps one of the greatest film openings ever. Its director, Francis Ford Coppola, set out to make an anti-war film. It was based on Joseph Conrad's indictment of Western imperialism, Heart of Darkness, but he makes parts of the war exhilarating and beautiful. Artists can deliberately glorify war, whether because they are paid to do so or because they believe in what they are doing, or both. Using art to depict and celebrate war goes back far into human history. So much of what has survived from the ancient world, sculptures, triumphal arches and columns, mosaics, decorated vases, tombs, deals with war. The Elgin marbles show men fighting the centaurs, half horse, half men. One of the treasures of Germany's Pergamon Museum, its great altar from the city of the same name, shows the legendary battle between the giants and the gods on Olympus. The Bayeux Tapestry records the Norman conquest of Britain. Giant stylized paintings of past victories on land and sea came to fill Europe's palaces and government buildings in the Renaissance, and the rulers. Orchestras played celebratory pieces such as Handel's music for the royal fireworks, composed in 1749 to mark an English triumph. In this case, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. The crucial Battle of Lepanto of 1571, when the Catholic states of the Holy League defeated the Ottomans, inspired works by Veronese, Tintoretto, Titian, and a host of lesser-known artists. Poems and music. The Battle of San Romano between Florence and Siena in the 15th century is now remembered mainly because of Paolo Uccello's triptych. Horses rear, men exchanged blows, broken spears, discarded helmets, and bodies littered the ground. But there is no blood, no smashed heads or severed limbs. Such depictions can remove war's terror, its chaos, and the human costs of fighting. Mughal paintings commissioned by rulers such as Akbar show sieges, battles, guns, soldiers, and cavalry, all very beautifully colored and decorative. Even the corpses. The famous 1945 Joe Rosenthal photography. Raising the flag on Iwo Jima, which was posed sometime after a smaller flag had been raised, captures a moment of triumph, but there is no hint of the 26,000 American casualties that victory cost. In 18th century Europe, which prided itself on being in the Age of Reason, artists, with very few exceptions, showed battles as orderly games, chess, perhaps, with human pieces. In 1745, in the Long War of the Austrian Succession, British forces, with their Dutch and Hanoverian allies, attacked the French at Fontenoy, now in Belgium. The battle, which resulted in a French victory, left some 5,000 men dead and another 10,000 wounded. Louis XIV commissioned a painting of the day by Pierre Lupf Enfant, whose son would design the plans for Washington, D.C. The soldiers are drawn up and are attacking in neat lines. There are puffs of smoke from the guns, men on horseback gallop about, and a handful of bodies lie decoratively on the ground. Paintings of the deaths of individual heroes in battle, Wolfe at Quebec or Nelson on his flagship, also show death coming decorously as the dying man lies in a graceful pose, surrounded by his mourners. The arts can make even the tools of war look pretty. Suits of armor, swords, scimitars, pikes, the early pistols and cannon were often beautiful objects embellished with precious metals and jewels. In demonstrations of the skill and vision of the craftsmen who designed and made them. It is a fashion we have lost, at least for military weapons. It is hard to imagine machine guns with inlaid decorations playing musical tunes, as it does with others, of society's resources, whether human, material, or spiritual. War co-opts the arts for its own needs, and artists can co-opt themselves. Jacques-Louis David, a great painter with a strong instinct for survival, started out and prospered under the Ancien Regime in France, adapted quickly to the French Revolution, and then became Napoleon's favorite painter. In his famous Napoleon Crossing the Alps, David shows a heroic figure on a rearing stallion ascending the slopes on his way to his victories in Italy. On stones by the horse's feet, the names of Hannibal and Charlemagne can be made out, but it is only Bonaparte's name that is spelled out clearly. In the First World War, artists and intellectuals rushed to condemn their counterparts on the other side. The war, said the prominent French philosopher Henri Bergson in a speech on August 8, 1914, was between French civilization and German barbarism. The German writer Thomas Mann also saw the war as a clash of different value systems, but in his case, it was German, vibrant, vital, deeply human, as opposed to civilization, which was mild, polite, and based on reason, not emotion. The entirety of Germany's virtue and beauty, he proclaimed, unfolds only in war. Peace is not always becoming to it. In peacetime, one could sometimes forget how beautiful Germany is. In the Second World War, Noel Coward wrote, directed, and starred in the film in which we serve, which praises the quiet heroism of the Royal Navy. The British government helped to pay for Laurence Olivier's stirring film, Henry V, in which he also starred. It came out in 1944, not long before the invasion of Normandy, and as Henry is courageous and noble, fighting in the right cause. The screenplay leaves out such scenes as Henry's threatening speech to the citizens of Harfleur. The Hollywood star John Wayne made the Green Berets at his own expense in support of the Vietnam War. In the last scene, a small Vietnamese boy, a war orphan who has been taken care of by one of a special forces team, the Green Berets weeps as he discovers his friend has been killed. "What will happen to me now?" the boy asks the colonel. Played by Wayne himself, Wayne gives the child the beret of the dead soldier. "You let me worry about that green beret," he says. "You're what this thing's all about." The two walk into the sunset as the Ballad of the Green Berets plays on the soundtrack. Wayne's film stands out because it was one of the few to show an increasingly unpopular war in a favorable light. In the First World War, by contrast, artists on all sides overwhelmingly supported their country's war efforts, at least in the early years of the conflict. Edward Elgar wrote patriotic music, including a score for Kipling's The Fringes of the Fleet, a 1915 booklet of poems and essays about the lesser-known heroic moments of British sea power. Although he came to hate the way that his pre-war pomp and circumstance marches had been given more bombastic words, the vast majority of novels and poems produced among all the belligerents were patriotic. Some like Thomas Hardy's Men Who March Away, which promises that victory crowns the just, by established poets, others by enthusiastic unknowns. In August 1914 alone, a major Berlin newspaper was getting 500 patriotic poems submitted a day. "We love as one, we hate as one. We have one foe, and one alone, England," said the wildly popular Ernst Lissauer's Hymn of Hate. With the growing size and demands of modern war, governments came to realize how they could use the arts just as they did science or industry in order to mobilize their societies. In the First World War, the British government commissioned well-known artists to camouflage first freighters. The Dazzle ships were covered with crazy designs to make it difficult for German submarines to estimate their speed and direction. A new Department of Information developed a series of projects employing artists to record the war and create propaganda for the home front. In the new industry of filmmaking, British and French studios turned out films on a wide range of subjects, from keeping the home fires burning to the iniquities of the Germans. The latter were shipped to neutral countries in attempts, often quite successful, to win people over to support the Allied cause. The German film industry, under tight government control, was slow to realize the power of the new medium, and its exported films had little impact. German films showing the front featured contented soldiers reading their post and eating some lightly wounded, recovering in hospitals, or German troops rebuilding churches that had been destroyed by the enemy. There were no battle scenes, which would have been difficult to film, and no dead. When German troops at the front were given showings, they roared with laughter. In the Second World War, German propaganda was much more effective. Its chief, Joseph Goebbels, said he had learned a lot from the British. Yet another front of struggle opened up with when arts produced by the enemy came under attack as so many Trojan horses in France again in the First World War. Camille Saint-Saëns and others formed the Ligue Nationale pour la Défense de la Musique Française to campaign for a ban on the performance of contemporary German music. After the massacres of women and children, Saint-Saëns asked, how can the French listen to Wagner? It is necessary to make the sacrifice of not reading or hearing the works of Wagner, because he thought Germany could use his work to conquer souls. In Britain, the press attacked orchestras for performing Beethoven, Brahms, or Bach. As Lord Lovat understood, music has a particular role to play on the battlefield. In The Drums of the Fore and Aft, one of his powerful stories about British soldiers on the frontiers of empire, Kipling may have been drawing on an incident from the Second Afghan War, when a British force initially falls back in the face of an Afghan attack. In his story, a pair of reprobate drummer boys, hard-drinking thugs at the age of 14, are left behind in the retreat. Having shared out their purloined rum, they pick up drum and fife and march out toward the Afghan lions, playing British grenadiers. Shamed by the boys, the fore and aft rejoin the battle coldly and efficiently, stabbing and killing until victory is theirs. The boys are buried along with the other British dead. According to Thucydides, the Spartans went into battle singing their war songs. He describes them advancing slowly toward the Argives and their allies in 418 BC during the Battle of Mantinea, to the music that came from flute players in their ranks. This custom of theirs has nothing to do with religion. It is designed to make them keep in step and move forward steadily without breaking their ranks, as large armies often do when they are about to join battle. In war, as in dance, music helps to train soldiers so that movements become automatic and they stay together even in battle. The great 18th century soldier Maurice Dussac, whose drilling was famous, said, have them march in cadence. There is the whole secret, and it is the military step of the Romans. Everyone has seen people dancing all night, but take a man and make him dance for a quarter of an hour without music, and see if he can bear it. Movement to music is natural and automatic. I have often noticed, while the drums were beating for the colors, that all the soldiers marched in cadence without intention and without realizing it. Nature and instinct did it for them. Sun Tzu advised commanders to use gongs and drums as well as banners to keep their troops together while marching, maneuvering, and charging, and to focus their attention on one particular point. On pre-modern battlefields, before field telephones, radios, or electronic communications, music was one of the few ways for commanders to signal orders. As European armies were to discover, high-pitched woodwinds and brass can carry over much battlefield noise. In the Napoleonic Wars, infantry regulations for the British Army listed a variety of messages that could be sent by music, advance, retreat, even warnings about the approach of enemy cavalry or infantry. and music could have a psychological impact on attackers and defenders alike. A British veteran of Wellington's Peninsular Wars against the French said that when the French drummers beat the pas de charge at the Battle of Waterloo, for the quickened step at the start of an attack, the sound was something few men, however brave they may be, can listen to without a somewhat unpleasant sensation in peacetime, as they did in the decades in Europe before the First World War. The arts can prepare the public psychologically for war. Military bands playing in bandstands in parks all over Europe, naval reviews on summer days, horse guards jingling down avenues in their dress uniforms. These were entertainment for the masses, but they were also powerful propaganda for war. In poems, heroic young men rallied their troops in far-off places against savage foes and went to their deaths with happy memories of home. Barbarossa slept in his mountain, and Drake in his hammock, waiting for the call to awaken and save their countries. Upper and middle-class boys, particularly in Britain, dreamed of glorious combat such as they had read about in Homer or Livy or Julius Caesar. Across Europe, the Middle Ages were being rediscovered, or rather a particular part, with chivalry and knights in armor and crusades. Popular fiction and magazines for boys largely wrote about the heroic deeds of the past. In Germany, the most popular subjects were the nation's great triumphs, whether the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in the 1st century A.D., when Germanic tribes defeated a Roman army, or victory over the French at Sedan in 1870. G.A. Henty, the popular British novelist, wrote over 80 books whose heroes were almost always decent British boys who overcame adversity and made their names in war to inculcate patriotism. "In my books," he said, "has been one of my main objects, and so far as it is possible to know, I have not been unsuccessful in that respect. Europe's young went to war in 1914, hoping for a chance to measure themselves against their heroes because of their education and their familiarity with literature, history, and myth." Members of that generation, novelists, poets, and memoirists such as Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen in Britain, Frederick Manning in Australia, or Henri Barbusse in France, were particularly well equipped to express their shock and disillusionment. They also resented attempts by civilian writers. "Eyewash," said a French writer to describe the front. We always need to remember, however, that the anti-war writers were much less popular, at least immediately after the war, than those like Younger, who talked about its heroic side. In the late 1920s, All Quiet on the Western Front sold 1.2 million copies in German before the Nazis banned it. But the memoirs of the Flying Ape, to Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, sold as many. One scholar estimates that only 5% of books produced about the war in the interwar years were pacifist. During the war, the authorities understood and tried to use the power of the arts, while at the same time managing portrayals of the front, so that the true nature of industrialized war did not horrify the public. British war artists were told not to include the bodies of the dead in their pictures. When Christopher Nevinson showed a pair of corpses lying face down on the ground in his 1917 work Paths of Glory, the censors would not pass it. Nevinson slapped a large censored sign over the picture, leaving only the sole of a boot and a helmet for the viewer's imagination. The German artist Georg Gross did a savage engraving of Christ in a gas mask, saying, "Shut your mouth and do your duty." His fellow German, Otto Dix, produced a series of horrific prints after the War of the Dead and the Mutilated, and a painting, The Trench, which showed bodies blown apart after an artillery attack. The new Nazi Party denounced him, and when it came to power, gave this work and others of his a prominent place in their degenerate art exhibition held in Munich in 1937. The struggle between those who would sanitize war and those who would show its brutality is a very old one, and the arts have a way of escaping or sliding away from controls. The British painter Paul Nash was an official war artist in the First World War, but his paintings from the front, such as The Men in Road and the ironically named We Are Making a New World, are a haunting testament to the loss and destruction. These are not the lovely British landscapes he had done before the war, but the reverse, with shattered trees, mud, and pools of putrid water. No happy picnickers here or cheerful peasants, but the lonely figures of advancing soldiers. I am no longer an artist. Interested and curious, he wrote to his wife in November 1917, I am a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever. Feeble, inarticulate will be my message, but it will have a bitter truth, and may it burn their lousy souls. Francisco Goya created his great series of prints, The Disasters of War, between 1810 and 1820, when Spain was afflicted by a weak government, French invasion, revolution, civil war, and a war between the French and the British. While he continued to work as painter to the Spanish court and also painted portraits of the French and British officers, he quietly made his prints published long after his death. They are a searing and powerful indictment of all sides in the wars and show the cruelty of which humans are capable. The Wild Beasts shows Spanish women, one with an infant on her arm, killing French soldiers, while Barbarians shows French soldiers shooting a monk tied to a tree as other soldiers look on indifferently. Goya's captions are terse but telling. One can't look. This is bad, this is worse, this is the worst. And he insists, I saw this. This is how it happened. Goya's work moved a long way from the orderly pictures of war of the 18th century, and his influence over later artists such as Otto Dix and Salvador Dali would be considerable. The war photographer Don McCullen said, When I took pictures in war, I couldn't help thinking of Goya. Picasso also thought of Goya, whom he revered, and in 1937 he created one of the greatest anti-war paintings of the 20th century. The Republican Spanish government, fighting for its survival against General Franco's nationalist rebels, commissioned Picasso to provide a mural for Spain's pavilion at the World's Fair in Paris. In April, he found his subject when German aircraft bombed Guernica. Picasso's painting of the event marked a significant shift in war paintings from concentrating on the military victims of war to the civilians working at high speed. He covered a large canvas with scenes of chaos and fear. Screaming people and a horse are flying apart. A woman carries her dead child. As he was painting, he issued a statement in the panel on which I am working, which I shall call Guernica, and in all my recent works of art, I clearly express my abhorrence of the military caste, which has sunk Spain in an ocean of pain and death. There is a story which may be true that a Gestapo officer visited Picasso in German-occupied Paris during the Second World War and saw a photograph of Guernica. Did you do that? He asked. No, Picasso replied, you did. Picasso would not allow the painting to return to Spain until its democracy had been restored. From 1981, it has been in Madrid, where it is seen as a national treasure. Not everyone has shared in the admiration for it. On the left, the communists, under the heavy hand of the Soviet Union, greeted it with faint praise and deplored it for not being realistic enough. The guide the Nazis produced for the World's Fair called it a hodgepodge of body parts that any 4-year-old could have painted. And when the painting went on tour in the United States before the Second World War, an American conservative said it was Bolshevist art controlled by the hand of Moscow. Can we appreciate a work of art if we disagree strongly with the views and purpose of the person who made it? Richard Wagner was an anti-Semite who wrote superb music, and Leni Riefenstahl was a committed Nazi who made innovative and powerful films. These have been difficult questions, especially in Israel. How we react to works of art depends on who we are, where we are standing, and when we encounter them. Robert Graves was surprised that his goodbye to all that was taken as an anti-war manifesto when he had only intended to describe the war. He was proud of his war service and perhaps to make some much-needed cash, but his book came out at the end of the 1920s, when disillusionment with the First World War and skepticism about the peace that followed were growing, and the future looked increasingly bleak. If we do not know much or anything about the Creator, such questions matter less, and the passage of time has a way of removing the emotions and ideas that surrounded works of art when they were new. Homer, if he existed, may have been admirable or dreadful, a lover of war or of peace, we will never know. And so we can read the Iliad and the Odyssey without having to take a stand on their creator. In Spain, Guernica is now a national treasure. But if Picasso had agreed to Franco's request to send it back after the Second World War, it might have been received differently. From the middle of the 19th century, photography and then film have increasingly taken their place beside painting to depict war. Whether or not what the new mediums show is somehow more authentic is another question. Cameras can select and distort as much as the artist's eye does. And again, it matters who you are and from what place you are looking. Although the earliest cameras could not show action, they could show the faces and the consequences of war. The successful photographer Matthew Brady decided to make as complete a record of the American Civil War as possible. In 1862, Alexander Gardner took what became the most famous series in the collection at the battlefield of Antietam, the bloodiest day of the Civil War. In one photograph, the crumpled bodies of soldiers stretch along an ordinary country road as it meanders into the distance. Does it make his photographs any less moving if we know that he often staged his scenes moving bodies about? In 1916, the British government broke with its practice of using film for anodyne and rather dull propaganda pieces and made a film of the first days of the Battle of the Somme. Because the military authorities had expected the opening attacks to break through the German lines, they had allowed unprecedented access to the cameramen. The cameras catch the soldiers preparing in their trenches, fitting bayonets to their rifles, and disappearing over the tops of the trenches into no man's land. The filming stops there. The early film cameras were too heavy to carry, and it was too dangerous for the cameramen to stand up as they needed to if they were to film the battlefield. The producers spliced in shots of training film to portray the actual attack, and then used real footage of the return of the wounded. Even so, the impact was deeply moving and troubling for British audiences, who for the first time got an approximation of what was happening on the Western Front. Nearly a quarter of the population had seen the film by the end of its first 6-week run in the summer of 1916, while the fighting in France went on. People wept, and some fainted. The other significant innovation in recording war was the appearance of the cheap still camera, which made it possible for every combatant to be his own artist. By the middle of the First World War, a small Kodak camera cost $1 and could fit in a uniform pocket. The authorities tried to censor the photographs as they did soldiers' letters, and the Canadians attempted to ban soldiers from carrying cameras, both unsuccessfully. As the technology continued to improve and camera equipment got much lighter, photographers were able to move about the battlefronts and capture fleeting instants, as Robert Capa did in his famous photograph of the Loyalist soldier at the moment he was shot in the Spanish Civil War. Today, soldiers in conflict zones such as Afghanistan and Iraq use their mobile phones. After the Vietnam War, the American military drew the conclusion that public support had waned because of the impact of the print and visual reports by the journalists, photographers, and writers who had been allowed to move quite freely through the war zones. Such pictures, as that of the Vietnamese child burned by napalm running down a road, the enemy soldiers seizing the perimeter of the American embassy in Saigon during the Tet Offensive, or the Saigon police chief shooting a captured North Vietnamese soldier in the head in its aftermath, persuaded significant numbers of Americans that the war was unwinnable and wrong. The military had a point, but it is debatable whether reporting was the major factor in turning public opinion against the war. The conflict was already unpopular, and so was the draft, and many Americans never understood why their country was fighting a long, drawn-out struggle in a small country on the other side of the world. Tim O'Brien may be right that we can never really get at the truth about war, but the arts help us to deal with it and to try to understand what may in the end be inexplicable. That is true as much of those who have fought as of those who have not. The Greeks saw Homer as a doctor of the soul. Philip Caputo gets letters from Vietnam veterans who have found that reading his A Rumor of War unlocked their bottled-up memories and feelings. A recent French study has looked at what ordinary French soldiers were reading in the trenches in the First World War. Many had only an elementary education, but they sent to their families and to booksellers for books such as Tolstoy's War and Peace. And perhaps they found not just greater understanding, but some comfort from the fact that there was something of beauty or importance that might outlast the misery of the present. The British writer Rebecca West was in a restaurant in Serbia in 1937, having an unpleasant argument with a fanatical German nationalist, when someone turned the radio on and a Mozart symphony poured out. How could we hope that art, would ever bring order and beauty to the whole of that vast and intractable fabric, that sail flapping in the contrary winds of the universe? She asked. Yet, she went on, the music promised us, as it welled forth from the magic box in the wall over our heads, that all should yet be well with us, that sometime our life should be as lovely as itself. Creating and consuming works of art can be an act of defiance as much as of hope. In the 2 world wars, prisoners of war staged plays and concerts. Olivier Messiaen, the French composer who became a German prisoner of war in 1940, discovered 3 fellow professional musicians, a clarinetist, a violinist, and a cellist in his camp. He managed to obtain some paper and a small pencil from a sympathetic guard and some battered old instruments, including a piano for himself. On January 15, 1941, out of doors in the rain, the quartet played the premiere of his Quatuor pour la fin du temps. He later recalled, "Never was I listened to with such rapt attention and comprehension." In 8 parts, his work is based on the New Testament's book of Revelation and deals with the end of time and the coming of the angel of the apocalypse. It ends with praise to the immortality of Jesus. "It is all love," said Messiaen. Its slow ascent to the acutely extreme is the ascent of man to his God, the child of God to his Father, the being made divine toward paradise. That promise and that defiance of the present are there too in one of the most memorable photographs of the Second World War, of St. Paul's Cathedral, still standing amidst the fires and destruction of the Blitz. The arts give us individual voices, sometimes from centuries past. One of the world's earliest poems from Sumer in the 3rd millennium BC mourns the consequences of defeat. "The foe trampled with his booted feet into my chamber. That foe reached out his dirty hands toward me. That foe stripped me of my robe, clothed his wife in it. That foe cut my string of gems, hung it on his child. I was to tread the walks of his abode." In the Iliad, when Andromache was wife of the great Trojan warrior, Hector learns that Achilles has killed him. She cries out, "Now you go down to the house of death, the dark depths of the earth, and leave me here to waste away in grief. A widow lost in the royal halls, and the boy only a baby. The son we bore together, you and I, so doomed. Kate Kollwitz was a left-wing artist who, with her doctor husband, ran a clinic in a poor part of Berlin before the First World War. When Peter, their 18-year-old son, wanted to volunteer for the German army in August 1914, she did not try to stop him. He left for the front on October 12th and was dead 10 days later. She never stopped mourning him and kept his bedroom just as he had left it. Peter was, she said, seed for the planting, which should not have been ground in time. She made a memorial in granite for the German cemetery at Roggeveld in Belgium, where he was buried. The grieving parents, as originally installed, showed the parents far apart, isolated in their grief. The mother has her head bowed and has wrapped her arms about herself. The father is upright, but he too has his arms wrapped around himself. In 1955, the cemetery was moved into a larger nearby one, and the Kollwitz figures now stand closer together. Mourning in the First World War drew on older rituals. The Greek columns or the statues in resembling ancient warriors, the wearing of black or the prayers for the dead. But it also seemed to need something new because of its scale and the ways in which the war had affected so many people. Fabian Ware, the hard-driving visionary, who effectively created the Imperial War Graves Commission for the British, insisted on 3 the men should be buried in the countries where they fell. There should be no distinction of rank, unlike in previous wars, and each man should get the same simple headstone. Although private citizens had always remembered their dead in their own ways, they now took the initiative in creating local rituals and memorials, and also in shaping official ones. Towns and villages across Europe and in parts of the empire raised local subscriptions for a variety of memorials, from monuments to parks, libraries, fountains, village halls, and hospitals. St. John's, Newfoundland built a memorial university in Cambridge near the railway station. A bronze statue of a striding soldier has a curiously short torso on long legs. Because the funds raised were not enough, and the size had to be reduced, the obelisk was a popular shape for a memorial because it was cheap and easy to make. Eventually, there were going to be 60,000 memorials in Britain and France alone. In 1919, the British authorities asked the prominent architect Sir Edward Lutyens, who had helped to design cemeteries for the British war dead, to make a temporary cenotaph for the Victory Parade that July along Whitehall in the heart of London. The symbol of an empty tomb was particularly fitting for the First World War, since the remains of so many of those who had died as a result of artillery fire could never be found and identified. Leichen's cenotaph, made of wood and plaster, attracted huge public attention, and the government had to leave it standing longer than planned, as hundreds of thousands visited it, leaving flowers and wreaths. The 2-minute silence, first observed on November 11, 1919, Armistice Day, and then annually during the 1920s and 1930s, was similarly embraced by the public. People gathered together in public spaces across the country. Traffic spontaneously came to a stop, and telephone operators pulled the plugs out of their switchboards, giving way to popular demand. The government asked Lutyens to design a permanent cenotaph in stone, which was unveiled in November 19th, the same day that the body of the unknown soldier arrived from the Western Front and was brought ceremonially through the streets on its way to Westminster Abbey. This, like the cenotaph, was a brilliant and simple way of dealing with the absence of bodies to be mourned. Everyone whose dead lay in anonymous graves now had a focus for their grief. Again, The authorities had to modify their plans and allow much greater public participation than they had intended. The grave at Westminster Abbey remained open for 2 weeks, and 1.25 million people filed past it in a silence broken only by shrieks and weeping. In the 1920s, Paris, Rome, Washington, D.C., Brussels, Prague, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Vienna followed suit, but Berlin and Moscow did not. The Second World War produced its own memorials, but in many cases, the ones from the previous war were simply adapted, with the names of the next generation of dead being added in. Today, in most countries which participated in the world wars, the commemoration of the dead includes all those who have died in war in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the public still continue to shape official remembrance in their own fashion. Veterans and their families come to the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington and leave tributes, bottles of beer, sometimes flowers, teddy bears at the foot of the wall. At the exhibition in 2014 of the more than 800,000 poppies, one for each of the British and Empire war dead in the First World War, the railings at the Tower of London were festooned with notes and photographs. How we remember and commemorate war reflects both the nature of war itself and the societies involved, and also who is doing the remembering. Veterans remember their dead comrades, women, their lost loved ones. The children of those who fought remember differently from the grandchildren, if they remember at all. While not all veterans want to remember, many join associations and go to reunions or make pilgrimages to former battlefields such as the Normandy beaches or Vietnam. They do not necessarily glorify war or support future wars. After the First World War, French veterans took the lead in criticizing what they thought were militaristic school curricula and former enemies, including French, German, and British veterans, came together at the conference International des Associations du Mutilé de Guerre et Anciens Combattants to work for improved benefits and peace. On the other hand, right-wing veterans associations in both France and Germany did their best to keep the wartime hatreds alive and turned on what they saw as traitors at home, variously the left, liberals, and Jews. Our attitudes to past wars are also influenced by what has happened since the Second World War, which is so often cast as a clear-cut struggle of good against evil, conveniently overlooking the fact that the Western powers were allied with the Soviet Union. One of the world's greatest tyrannies has shaped present thinking about the First World War, which now appears morally ambiguous, foolish, and futile. The men who fought and died between 1914 and 1918 are now pitied rather than admired lions led by donkeys, as the British politician Alan Clark falsely claimed a German general had said of British soldiers. The popular view today, and not just among the British, is that those who fought in the First World War were dupes, lured to the battlefields by irresponsible elites wielding slogans about fighting for civilization or king and country or the home fires. We should be careful about condescending to those who lived in the past. The dead had ideas and beliefs, just as we do. We may not agree with them, but we should respect them. Those who went off to the First World War did think they were fighting for something worthwhile, more usually their loved ones than abstractions such as democracy or empire. In the 1920s, those remembering the First World War on the Allied side certainly tended to see it as a sacrifice, but a necessary one. Germans did not so much question the rightness of the war itself, but the injustice, as they saw it, of the peace. How did the heroes die? Asked a plaque at a cemetery in Tübingen. Fearlessly and loyally was the answer. Across Germany, local communities planted heroes' groves. In Britain, inscriptions on memorials, including the cenotaph in London, referred to the glorious dead. And at the annual services of commemoration, congregations were reminded they did not die in vain. Canada's War Memorial at Vimy Ridge mourned Canada's dead, but it also showed what they had died for. Stone figures represent faith, justice, peace, honor, charity, truth, knowledge, and hope. When it was unveiled, speakers referred to the site as hallowed ground. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig is now widely seen as a cold-hearted butcher, but in the 1920s, he was a hero. Huge numbers of veterans turned out for his funeral in 1928. It was only in the 1930s, as the possibility of another war grew ever more likely, that people in Britain and France began to wonder if the First World War had been worth it. And the works of Sassoon Graves and others seen as anti-war started to resonate with the public. The poetry of Wilfred Owen, now seen as the preeminent poet of the war, was known only to a small circle. Before 1945, the vast majority of the works published in the interwar years regarded the war as a just one, and opinions still remain divided on its meaning even after the Second World War. Until the 1970s, there were enough veterans to give a range of views on the war, from its futility to its validity. When they disappeared from the scene, views in Britain swung firmly around to seeing the First World War as an appalling mistake, which it seemed pointless to go on commemorating. Popular television programs, such as the 1989 Blackadder, Goes Forth, served to reinforce the tendency to see the war as a monumental folly. In many countries that had participated in that war, there was talk of canceling remembrance ceremonies. In Australia, the left was criticizing Anzac Day for glorifying the war and empire and for being an excuse to get drunk. Only 2,000 people were turning out for the dawn service at the War Memorial in Canberra. In Canada, very little attention was paid to the anniversaries of the taking of Vimy Ridge. And the memorial in France, put up in the 1930s, was crumbling and discolored. In Britain, there was talk in the 1980s of dropping Remembrance Day services in churches and ending the November 11th ceremonies. Yet between 2014 and 2018, as a series of anniversaries for the war fell due, public interest and engagement in Britain was high. Hundreds of thousands came to see the ceramic poppies at the Tower of London, and many more saw them when they went on tour around the country. In 2015, the public demand for places at the Gallipoli commemorations in Turkey was so high that the Australian and New Zealand governments had to hold a lottery. In 2019, more than 35,000 came to the annual dawn service at the War Memorial in Canberra. What had happened between the 1970s and the present? Part of the answer may be that, at least in certain countries, well-organized lobby groups have pushed for government support for commemorations, and to make such symbolic gestures as the wearing of the poppy every November mandatory for television presenters. In 1997, the Spice Girls launched an appeal on behalf of the British Legion to raise funds, but also to push for the reintroduction of the 2-minute silence on November 11th, and to encourage young people to wear poppies. "Millions of people died so that we could be free," said Sporty Spice. The group got a certain amount of criticism when it launched a new album the following week, along with a host of paraphernalia for sale to their fans. The First World War also resonates in a world where we are experiencing rapid change, as Europe was before 1914, where globalization has brought both winners and losers, and where the international scene appears increasingly troubled and unstable. Europe's leaders may have started the First World War by accident, not seeing where it might lead and what its costs would be. Are we in danger of the same thing happening today? As the historian Dan Todman argues, we face a number of questions today that were raised by that war. What was the relationship of individuals to the vast, faceless organizations of which they were part? Could individuals control their fates, or were they just cogs in the machine? With the advent of greater democracy, how did the citizen relate to the government? As we tend to paint the past with broad brushstrokes, we also fix on certain episodes to stand in for the whole. In recent commemorations for the First World War, the British focused largely on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which has come to represent the huge cost of the war to Britain and the beginning of the end for the British Empire as the world's leading power. Australians remembered Gallipoli when Australian lives were wasted in a poorly planned attack, while for Canadians it is Vimy Ridge, when Canadian forces successfully took a German strongpoint which had resisted all earlier attacks. The French commemoration of the First World War was centered on Verdun, the site of that long battle of attrition which drew in such a large part of the French army. Such memories are often highly selective. New Zealanders, as they point out, were there at Anzac Cove as part of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and the Canadians at Vimy fought beside British troops. Not all the former belligerents felt the need to stage large-scale commemorations. The American commemorations were slow to start and remained low-key, largely driven by volunteers. For the United States, the Second World War is the one that really counts. When the country fought a gigantic struggle around the globe and emerged as a world power, the Russians have paid relatively little attention to the First World War, because for them, its legacy is very mixed. The collapse of the old regime during the war brought to power the Bolsheviks, who have themselves now vanished. So how to remember, and what is problematic? The Great Patriotic War, as the Russians called the Second World War. Above all, its Battle of Stalingrad is a much more important commemoration for the Russians. The Germans and the Japanese bear a heavy burden of guilt from the Second World War, and seem to have little interest in commemorating the earlier war. India sent millions of troops to both wars, but the struggle for independence plays a much greater part in public and official memory. For Poland, on the other hand, the First World War is the time of its rebirth, when all three of its enemies, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, were defeated, while the British, the Americans, and the Russians have remembered the Second World War with pride. The French responses have been more mixed. For decades, French scholars and writers stayed away from the reasons for France's collapse in 1940, or the subsequent collaboration of so many French, not least the Vichy government, with the Nazis. The key works were written by British or American historians. The resistance, however, did receive French attention. When General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, arrived in Paris just after its liberation in 1944, he spoke at the City Hall. Paris, he said, was liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the support and the help of the whole of France. It was a wild distortion of the truth, but he was trying to paper over the divisions in French society and build a shared narrative to serve the cause of French unity. When Marcel Lafosse made his shocking documentary, Le Chagrin et le Sorrow and the Pity in 1969, exploring both collaboration and resistance and the involvement of French people in the persecution and removal to the death camps of French Jews, it was banned from French television when the network's director general appealed to de Gaulle. The general apparently replied, "France does not need truths, she needs hope." The film was finally shown in 1981, after de Gaulle had died. Remembrance of past wars often gets tangled up with current social and political debates. Much of the left would prefer not to teach about war at all, unless it shows the folly and wickedness of the past. Conservatives tend to decry the teaching of history, which in their view concentrates too much on their country's past mistakes and not enough on its great victories. As Michael Gove argued when he was in charge of British education, British schools were giving too much of the Blackadder view of the First World War, and not pointing out that it was a good and necessary struggle. Museums draw particular fire. While they may be founded as centers of education and research, the public tends to see them as memorials. Australia has dealt with that by having a war memorial, which is also a museum in Washington. In the 1990s, the Smithsonian ran into trouble when it put on an exhibition featuring the Enola Gay, the plane that had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, in which the curators tried to call attention to the human cost on the ground and the moral issues surrounding the bomb's use. In the ensuing uproar, conservatives, veterans, and armed forces associations all weighed in, and the Smithsonian canceled the exhibition. In the continuing discussions among the British over whether to stay in or leave the European Union, the Leave side in particular have used the example of Dunkirk. Indeed, the prominent Leaver Nigel Farage has said that everyone should see the recent movie of that name. The British, he and others argue, fought alone then and endured to triumph in the end. Such a version of the past conveniently ignores the fact that Britain had the support of its empire, that there were many overseas troops fighting in both France and the Middle East, and that the Royal Air Force was filled with foreign pilots, including Poles. Moreover, it ignores the crucial role of the Soviet Union and the United States in defeating the Germans. The Russians make a similar use of Stalingrad as a symbol of the unbowed Russian nation. President Trump tried to demonstrate his and the Republicans' commitment to the American armed forces at the 4th of July celebrations in 2019 by using the War of Independence, although he spoiled the effect by getting key details wrong. The president is only the latest in a long line of leaders appealing to past wars to build political support and to promote a particular view of the nation. In the decade before the First World War, at a time of heightened nationalism, Europe saw a series of big state-sponsored commemorations of anniversaries of past triumphs. Trafalgar for the British. In 1905, Borodino for the Russians in 1912, and in 1913 at Leipzig for the Germans, with a series of events that included a display of some 275,000 gymnasts. A new cathedral is being built today outside Moscow, which will use German military hardware captured by the Red Army in the Second World War to build the main steps. The defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said the cathedral was to serve God and the country, and that he wants every square meter to be symbolic. War can also be a vehicle for reconciliation, however. In Slovenia's Kobrid, once called Caporetto, and the site of Italy's most devastating defeat in the First World War, a museum commemorates all the men who died there. The Historial du la Grande Guerrero Museum of the Great War at Péronne, in France, near the Western Front, commemorates the Battle of the Somme as a shared experience for the British, French, and Germans. It was, says the American Jay Winter, who was one of the 3 senior historians involved, a transnational project from the start. The exhibits are designed to show the commonalities, not the differences between soldiers and civilians on all sides, and to show that whichever trench you were in, your sufferings would have been much the same. As war undergoes yet another revolution in the 21st century, we will continue to probe its mysteries. Our artists will continue to grapple with its horror and beauty, its baseness and its nobility, its boredom and excitement, its devastation and its creativity. And all of us will wonder how best to commemorate and remember war. Conclusion. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing in the grass that is overgrown causes and effects. Someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. Wisława Szymborska, the end and the beginning. A few years ago, I visited a small town in the south of France, near the border with Spain. In the church's graveyard were leaning, crumbling tombstones marking overgrown grassy hummocks, the graves of British soldiers who had died nearby in one of Wellington's battles as he chased Napoleon's forces northward. It was a very peaceful spot, and you could imagine that in a few more years the stones would have merged with the earth and there would be little trace left of the graves. Perhaps that is what we should be doing with past wars, letting them slide away into oblivion and allowing the shades of all those who died finally rest. Perhaps we are making a mistake. When we commemorate the anniversaries of wars, build our war museums, reenact battles, or carefully tend war cemeteries and war memorials, do we risk making war a commonplace, something that is part of being human and an ever-present force in our histories and our societies? A tool that can rightfully and necessarily be used by states, something we might even be proud of? And above all, by studying and thinking of war, do we make it more likely? Western societies today have a curiously mixed attitude to war. We commemorate it and have a huge appetite for war stories, movies, and games. But for the most part, we do not want to fight wars. The high costs of 2 world wars have left us unwilling to contemplate such casualties ever again. We mourn over our soldiers who die in conflicts in Afghanistan or Iraq, and even casualties of a few hundreds where once we accepted many thousands. They seem too much. The military and their civilian masters are well aware of this and invest heavily in weapons and other defensive measures, which will minimize as much as possible the danger to our fighters. Germany and Japan, where the military dominated and their values permeated society, are now peaceable and peace-loving, except among a small subgroup of military families. The military is no longer seen as a desirable career. Students at leading universities dream of careers on Wall Street, or in the City of London, or in the media, not in armies, or navies, or air forces. Perhaps we need not worry about the power of the past. We may have moved beyond war. Our political leaders may shrink from starting hostilities if they know we will not fight or support a war. And yet the West is only a part, and a shrinking part of the world, and its assumptions and values are not necessarily universal ones. Apprehension over losses did not bother the Chinese Communist leadership when they ordered human wave attacks in the Korean War, or the North Vietnamese in the long struggle against the French, and then the Americans or the Ayatollahs in the Iran-Iraq War when they sent their troops out across the Iraqi minefields. The sub-state actors such as Al-Qaeda or ISIS, with their international networks of fanatical volunteers, do not care about casualties, either their own or those of innocent civilians. And while the West has enjoyed peace at home, the world has seen, depending on how you count them, between 150 and 300 armed conflicts since 1945. Some, such as the Korean or Iran-Iraq wars, have been like many earlier ones between states, but by far the greatest number have been inside states. Whether struggles for independence against imperial rulers, as in Algeria or Indonesia, or civil wars and outside powers, have frequently joined in expressing the highest principles and acting all the while to further their own interests as political structures. Often fragile to begin with, splinter war becomes an ever-shifting game where the stakes are life and death played between relatively sophisticated bodies such as state-states or religious movements at the one extreme and criminal gangs and mercenaries at the other. Ending such wars, as Europe's 30 Years' War in the 17th century showed, and Afghanistan and Somalia show today, is a hard and long task, and the factors that produce war, greed, fear, ideology will continue to work among us as they always have. The impacts of climate change, such as the struggle for scarce resources and thus steed.